Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to retired Air Force General David Deptula, Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, about the future of U.S. air power, whether the Pentagon is focusing too heavily on drones, and how much behind-the-scenes work and planning goes into U.S. airstrike missions abroad. Then we break down the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and its political impacts around the world, the Defense Department's clash with Washington think tanks, and much more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Jam-packed show this week, and I think maybe one of my favorite interviews of the year so far, coming with retired Air Force General David Deptula, one of the world's leading experts on air power and all things aerospace. Very interesting stuff to say about the future of U.S. aerospace power and also whether the Pentagon is focusing too heavily on drones and unmanned systems. But before we get to that, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you for another week. There are several things I'm tracking. Off the top, it feels like we're in an inflection point with regard to the Trump administration's posture toward human suffering among Palestinians in Gaza, regardless of the administration's support of Israel's war against Hamas. Images of starving Palestinian children in recent days have created a kind of shockwave effect, which found President Trump himself acknowledging in public remarks on July 28 that there is, quote, real starvation, end quote, occurring in Gaza. This jumped out at me, Ben, because it showed a rift in rhetoric between Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has continued to try and say there is not starvation in Gaza and basically to downplay the extremity of the humanitarian crisis in the Palestinian enclave in the wake of Israel's all-out war against Hamas militants who had controlled and actually continue to control parts of Gaza. I've noticed an increase in recent days among opinion leaders in Washington, Ben, including among some prominent Republicans and former intelligence and national security officials, essentially highlighting the human suffering and starvation. Longtime former diplomat and intelligence official Joseph Detrani, a regular Threat Status contributor, by the way, he wrote an op-ed this week titled, "While Leaders Talk, Children Starve in Gaza and Ukraine." He pointed out human suffering from wars on basically every continent right now. But I want to point out, Ben, that our own reporter, Vaughn Cocaine, he's a stalwart member of the Threat Status team. He was tapped with asking the first question at the State Department's press briefing on July 29. And he asked whether the contradictory statements from Trump and Netanyahu on the humanitarian crisis has generated a real rift between the two leaders that could derail Trump's push on Israel to reach a ceasefire and end the war in Gaza. Department spokeswoman Tammy Bruce gave a lengthy response, but a key to what she said was that Trump and Netanyahu, they have, quote, a good relationship, end quote, but that this, quote, fluid, dynamic situation, end quote, is what's occurring in Gaza. So that in itself is an acknowledgement that the administration is taking the humanitarian crisis more seriously now. The big question is whether children starving in Gaza prompts Trump to essentially demand that Israel let in more humanitarian aid and end the war with Hamas. We're tracking all that closely, particularly because of Hamas propaganda that smears a lot of the information coming out of Gaza, but also because Hamas has been an Iran-backed proxy targeting Israel for more than a decade. And frankly, has been listed by the United States as a terrorist organization. We could go down the rabbit hole with all of that, Ben. I will note that the State Department in recent days slammed the United Nations for holding a two-state solution conference on the Israel-Palestinian issue, all while the governments of France, Britain, and Canada have now said they would recognize the existence of a Palestinian state during the upcoming UN General Assembly in late September if Israel doesn't fix the situation and allow in major humanitarian aid. Shifting gears quickly, Ben, it caught my eye that Taiwan's president has postponed a planned trip to Latin America that would have included stops in the U.S. After President Trump is said to have opposed a U.S. visit out of concern that it could disrupt trade talks with China. I'm tracking this, Ben, because there's a lot of speculation that Trump is trying to appease China on this issue ahead of a potential visit to Beijing to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping, likely in September. I explore all of this, by the way, Ben, in a Threat Status Influencers video interview with Miles Yu. He was a top advisor on China policy in the first Trump administration. Listeners can easily find that video by Googling Miles Yu, Threat Status Influencers. Anyhow, there have been signs from the Chinese Communist Party that President Xi might not grant Trump a summit unless Trump makes some statements that the U.S. would not militarily defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese military invasion of the island democracy. The point here is that Taiwan factors big into the U.S. China relations right now, Ben. It's a moment when Trump is trying to rearrange the U.S. China trade relationship and a bunch of other things. I want to point out that the whole U.S. China great power competition touches just about everything at this point in geopolitics. Consider that top officials from the United Kingdom and Australia made global headlines in recent days with statements that they would militarily defend Taiwan if China were ever to invade. Our own Washington Times Asia editor Andrew Salmon wrote in a July 29 dispatch from the region that the audience that Australia and Britain were targeting with those statements may be less Chinese and more American, given that London and Canberra are keen to proceed with the trilateral nuclear submarine deal that the two signed with the Biden administration back in 2021, the so-called AUKUS deal, which the Trump administration, by the way, is rather critically reviewing at the moment.
Yeah. On Gaza, just quickly, we had retired British Army Colonel Richard Kemp on the show a couple of weeks ago talking about his experience with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the U.S. and Israel-backed relief group in Gaza. And, he frankly tried to paint a pretty positive picture of the work that group is doing. And I have no doubt they are trying their best, but it's also just in the interest of fairness, I think, incumbent upon us to point out that the situation seems to have been deteriorating pretty rapidly under their supposed watch in terms of taking the lead of distributing food and water to the people of Gaza. Now, again, they'll blame that on Hamas, who no doubt is playing a role in obstructing that to some degree. But as you point out, Guy, it's reaching critical mass, I think, at this point. And just about everybody, including now the president of the United States, Donald Trump, agrees the status quo isn't acceptable. Speaking of President Trump and Republicans, we've talked a lot in this show about U.S. military and financial aid to Ukraine. And in particular, I've always been especially fascinated by the politics of this, especially inside the GOP. It feels like so long ago now, but remember, President Trump came to office with what I think fairly could be described as a, borderline hostile attitude toward Ukraine in some ways. There was the disastrous Oval Office meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. You had top administration officials like Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth going out of their way to say that Ukraine would never get its territory back from Russia. Other officials saying Ukraine wouldn't join NATO. And beyond the administration, there was a general attitude among some Republicans, certainly the MAGA wing of the party, if you want to call it that the U.S. needed to cut Ukraine aid or at least threaten to do so as leverage to get a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Fast forward to today, and you've got...
Did you see these poll results, Ben, that...
No, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm getting to that in just a second, because the poll results, I think, come against this backdrop of, Trump being publicly frustrated with Putin, pledging more weapons, on the verge of secondary tariffs on Russia's oil industry, which a lot of Republicans, including Michael McCaul, who was on the podcast last week, support. And he's not the only one because, as you mentioned, this survey of GOP voters by public opinion research firm American Viewpoint, just 41% of Republicans surveyed said they would support cutting off additional aid to Ukraine. That's down from 58% just back in February. That's a huge shift. And it's, of course, largely driven by Trump's own personal shift on the issue, as his voters do tend to follow his lead pretty closely on this. It makes me wonder if Russia miscalculated here to some degree. I mean, Vladimir Putin seemed to want to capitalize on political divisions in the U.S., use it to his advantage. But those divisions are now kind of shrinking, or the gaps are closing. We'll see if Trump follows through in his threat to finally go after Russia's oil sector with the full economic weight of the U.S., as plenty of analysts have been telling me the U.S. should do for months now. Speaking of analysts, Guy, one more thing I want to mention just for a minute here before we get to General Deptula. I have an in-depth story coming out soon in the Washington Times examining the implications of the Pentagon's new policy on think tanks and whether military officials can attend events, forums, roundtables hosted by those think tanks. Guy and I have been to dozens, maybe even hundreds of these between us over the years. We're talking about events at the Atlantic Council, the Brookings Institution.
It's called civil society, Ben. I'm like astounded by this story, but can you please continue? I'm excited because your piece, we haven't published your piece yet, but it's coming. It'll probably be out by the time the podcast.
It should be out, if not by the time you listen to this podcast, certainly shortly thereafter. Look, yeah, you said it. It's U.S. civil society. That's what this is. Researchers, scholars, lots and lots of former government officials and folks who will find their way back into government down the road, working on issues that civil society and policy discourse that Guy and I are a part of really every day. Now, the Pentagon says it will conduct a thorough vetting of all such think tanks before allowing any military officials to speak there. You remember a few weeks ago, this, of course, started with the DoD abruptly pulling a host of military officials from the Aspen Security Forum, which Guy attended at the last minute, saying the forum is globalist and doesn't align with the values of DoD.
There were high-level Trump officials former Trump officials, like for instance, Mark Esper, who was SecDef under Trump. He was there at Aspen. There's just so much conversation about how this is a manifestation of the actual riff within Trump world and national security right now. And what's dangerous, and I think the most sensitive thing about it, is that for a long time, there's been this allegation that it's under Democratic administrations where intelligence gets politicized. I draw a direct parallel between those types of allegations and this concern that if you have a Republican administration and it basically says, no, our appointees won't talk to anybody unless we've scrubbed the think tank, the Brookings Institution, or something that might be considered left by a large group of people, but by the way, does have a handful of Republicans, or it just becomes partisan very quickly. And I have to tell you, I've been to so many events in Washington where, including at USIP, which has been in the crosshairs of the administration, where I saw Jake Sullivan with Mike Waltz on stage together talking about cooperating over the very sensitive transfer of power between administrations on national security that should not be partisan. So I'm not going to I've probably already taken a position on this, but it's a sensitive issue.
Well, it is a sensitive issue, and I think you kind of touched on it, to me, what is the most important question surrounding it, which is why anybody should care. Because let's face it, to a degree, this can feel like inside baseball, right? Washington think tanks, public officials, journalists like me and Guy in the middle of it. Some might say that's as swampy as it gets.
But you and I, we both work with a lot of younger journalists. Something that happens when you're a reporter in this town covering national security or intelligence is you end up training up and comers. And one of the best ways to educate people is to say, go to this thing and learn about this, Boko Haram crisis in Central Africa right now. And don't form an opinion, but here's a resource. Here's a bunch of former officials from the military talking about it. Those types of events are essential to educating people about the world.
Absolutely. Without that element of civil society, without forums for public conversations, debates, I think discourse in this country just, quite frankly, could get dumber or at least less informed and less nuanced. I mean, certainly from the journalist perspective, Guy and I can tell you that a lot of sources that we get are folks in the think tank world who have either come out of the government or are going to go back into the government during a changeover in administrations a couple of years down the road. That helps us get information that we then funnel to the public.
Especially if those people are communicating directly with folks that are in government and advising them.
So, yeah, I mean, look, at the risk of sounding, too much like rah-rah patriotic American guy over here, civil society in the U.S. really is pretty unique and plays an invaluable role in promoting healthy discussion. So if nothing else, it's just going to be a shame if military officials can't take part in that for the next 3.5 years. And we're joined now by retired Air Force Lieutenant General David Deptula. He's the Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies and one of the world's foremost experts on all things aerospace. General Deptula served in uniform for more than 30 years, a very long and distinguished career that included serving as the principal attack planner for the Operation Desert Storm air campaign, director of the air campaign over Afghanistan after 9/11. And I could go on and on, General, with your expansive, impressive resume, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Great to be here, and I look forward to our discussion.
Of course. Let's start, if you'll pardon the pun, with sort of the 35,000-foot question on U.S. air power and the future of the U.S. Air Force. We talk a lot in this show about, for example, drone swarms and other unmanned vehicles. Just last week, we wrote about a new memo out of DoD on drone dominance. The Army wants to give soldiers small drones down at the tactical level. It seems like a lot of buzz in the defense industry right now is around unmanned AI, autonomy, small, attritable drones. So just big picture, what's the role of folks like yourself in this new environment? Where do more traditional aircraft and the human beings that pilot them, where do they fit into this new dynamic?
Well, it's a great question. And oh, by the way, you're talking to the guy who had the portfolio that incorporated remotely piloted aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, whatever you'd like to call them, into the mainstream of the Air Force in my last job as the Director of Air Force Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance. I increased the use of UAVs in the Air Force by over 700%. So I'm a big fan. That said, there's some out there who've postulated that, drones are going to take over the world and they're going to offset inhabited aircraft, if you will, crewed aircraft. The most famous among them being Elon Musk saying that, hey, we don't need any more F-35s. We can all go to drones. Well, I think that Israel's use of the F-35 and penetrating into the heart of Iran, completely eliminating their integrated air defense system and achieving air superiority in a matter of days, which then gave them free rein over Iran to significantly reduce their nuclear program, has proven Elon perhaps a little bit too enthusiastic with his acceptance of, or his statements that we need to do away with inhabited aircraft. It's not a matter of either or, it's a matter of both. And incorporating AI, machine learning, what has become known as collaborative combat aircraft, in with the proven capabilities of inhabited aircraft as we move forward. So the military's got to resist the temptation to see drones as silver bullets, if you will. These systems are tools. They're not substitutes for a comprehensive air power strategy. And as I mentioned, the real value lies in integration.
No, absolutely. And we'll come back to this big picture in a second. But since you mentioned Iran, I want to ask you about this, because I think you can maybe, for folks like myself and the vast, vast majority of listeners who never have flown missions like this, you might be able to kind of maybe give us some insights into this. Operation Midnight Hammer, the U.S. mission that targeted Iranian nuclear facilities last month that originated out of an Air Force base in Missouri. So you have, B-2 Spirit bombers dropping these large bunker buster bombs on an 18-hour or so flight to Iran and then back. So you're talking 36, 37 hours round trip. What are those missions like for pilots? I mean, is it just small talk about families and sports, or is there work that has to be done the entire flight time? I'm just fascinated to know what it's like to sort of be in the cockpit on mission for that long a period of time, flying literally around the world.
You raise an excellent point. Operation Midnight Hammer certainly deserves an A+ when it comes to performance, because it was a spectacular demonstration of what air and space power can achieve. You get right to it in the context of the pilots, and not just the pilots, because look, it is a team endeavor along with the maintenance folks. But yeah, they're up there for 37 hours in an airplane. It's a combination of what you alluded to. Absolutely, there is mission that has to be accomplished, because remember, as long range as the B-2 is, it still requires refueling on a mission that's 7,000 miles one way, and then to return again. And so they make the mission look easy when in fact it's not. It requires years of training, absolute exquisite skills. You're flying this extraordinarily complex and the world's most capable stealth bomber, even though it's over 30 years old. I like to remind the audience. Yeah, the pilots are on their game when they're flying those missions. Not to mention when you're entering some of the most highly defended airspace in the world, and yes, it had undergone days of attack, but you don't know until you actually penetrate enemy airspace. That's part of why there were, it wasn't just the B-2s that were involved, but the strike package involved over 125 other U.S. aircraft that people tend to forget about. So it's the coordination of all of those aircraft to assure that enemy air defenses are suppressed, and to put together the command and control elements that are so important in orchestrating this entire mission to get those GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators onto the targets that occurred. So lots that was going on at the same time. It's 37 hours, so those pilots do need a little bit of shut-eye. So they alternate climbing out of their cockpit seats and grabbing a sleeping bag and laying on the floor in a fashion that they can garner a bit of shut-eye.
Right. Well, I mean, it was a great reminder, I think, for everybody of the professionalism and the capabilities that the U.S. military has. But I want to ask you sort of big picture where we're going on that front, and particularly how U.S. air dominance and the capabilities of the U.S. Air Force today and going forward stack up with our peers, our adversaries. We're talking about Russia and particularly about China. Do you see the U.S. edge in air dominance deteriorating right now, and what can be done about it if so?
Well, Ben, it's a great question. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take what I just told you about the magnificent performance of the aircrew members, as well as the maintainers that assured that those aircraft were available, and to make you and the American public aware of what they didn't see. And that's that this operation, Midnight Hammer, drove into the heart of the Iranian airspace, was fantastic. But that one-day operation maxed out our available long-range stealth strike capability. What people don't know is the United States Air Force only fields 19 B-2 bombers. And as I mentioned, they're more than 30 years old. We used essentially that entire B-2 force to generate those 7 aircraft that went in the direction of Iran, the other decoy aircraft that went in the other direction, because nominally, because of what's known as mission capability rates, those are about 50%, which means that on average, about 50% of your bomber force, in this case, less than 10 aircraft, are, in some form of maintenance, if you will. So that just gives you an indicator. We couldn't do this again if we had to do it the next day. It would take quite a while to recover. Now, I'll also mention that while we're on the bomber force, the B-2 fleet out there is the preponderance of our bomber force It just turned 73 years old. I mean, it had its first flight 73 years ago. Our T-38s, which is still the premier and most advanced trainer that the Air Force uses in training new pilots, had its first flight in 1959. Today, the Air Force is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready in its history. And that's not an opinion. It's a fact, and it's a strategic liability. For 30 years in a row, the Air Force was underfunded relative to the Army and the Navy, to the degree that 20 years post 9/11, the Army received over $1.3 trillion more than the Air Force, and then the Navy almost $1 trillion more. On average, just the Army alone, it received $65 billion a year more than the Air Force. Now, I don't begrudge the Army that money, okay, because during in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Army were the preponderance of forces. But we're no longer in Iraq or Afghanistan. And just as we shifted money to the Army, it's time to shift money to the Air Force to recover from the nosedive that it's in.
Well, General, let me drill into that for a second, because one of the areas that this could come back to bite us in the future, as you well know, is in a potential Pacific clash with China. I mean, from an air power perspective, what do we need to do first? Where should the money go? You've run air campaigns, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, for the U.S. military, major air campaigns. From that big picture perspective, what would give you the most problems or the most pause right now in a theater like the Pacific?
I told you those B-2s, only 19 of them. That's an insufficient number of penetrating bomber aircraft. So to be ready to deter, which is really what we want to do, but in order to deter, you have to have the capability to win. Deterrence is about injecting sufficient uncertainty into your adversary's mind that they wouldn't risk taking aggressive action against the United States. Well, to do that, we need to rebuild our bomber force. Now, fortunately, we've got the B-21 that is currently undergoing low-rate production now. And I would suggest to you, we need to push it up. We need to double the production of the B-21. We need to recapitalize our geriatric fighter force. Our average fighter force today is over 30 years old. We've had to withdraw aircraft that we used to populate the Pacific with because they simply were no longer viable. These are the F-15Cs. But we're not producing enough aircraft to replace them. I'm specifically talking about the F-35, okay? We're not producing sufficient numbers to recover from the decline that the Air Force is in. So the short answer to your question is we've got to build sufficient numbers of bombers and fighters to modernize our Air Force, which I mentioned is the oldest and the smallest it's ever been.
General, time flies here. So the last couple minutes that we have left here, I want to talk to you about space because, of course, we could spend multiple episodes and multiple interviews talking about just that. But when I first met you, I guess 7-8 years ago, was around the time the Space Force was kind of getting off the ground. And as you, I'm sure, remember, around that time, we were seeing comedy sketches on Jimmy Kimmel and late night TV making fun of the idea of the Space Force and, you know, playing clips from Star Wars and mocking it. And fast forward to today, and nobody's making fun of the Space Force anymore, at least that I can see. I think there's been a realization over the past few years among the public, or at least large segments of the public, the importance of space when it comes to U.S. national security. Are we where we need to be on this from a national security perspective, or where do you want to see this go? Does the Space Force just need a bigger budget, more personnel? Do we need a department of space, for example? What are the next steps to maintain or establish U.S. dominance in space?
Yeah, well, first, I hope there is the realization, if you can sit down with someone and explain to them that, look, without space, you know, and you're not going to be able to get your car full of gas. Without space and what we do in space, you can't withdraw any money from your ATM. And oh, by the way, you can't withdraw any money from your bank. And oh, by the way, you can't make any investments in your 401k or the stock market, because all of these systems rely on the timing signals that are hosted by our global positioning satellite systems. We are extraordinarily dependent on space. So I hope folks realize that. Now, we kind of took space for granted because we viewed it for decades as a protected domain, as one that, there would be no. A matter of fact, it was U.S. policy that you even couldn't mention the word war and space in the same sentence until there was the realization that the Chinese were determined to turn space into a warfighting domain, along with the Russians, through their development of anti-satellite capabilities. That's part of the rationale for standing up the Space Force is, hey, we got to pay attention to this. We have to protect this very fragile infrastructure. Well, in order to do that, you've got to fund the Space Force such that it can build those kinds of counter-offensive space systems that are necessary to defend our satellites and assure that they can continue to operate. So the short version, and I know time flies, but the Space Force is underfunded, it's undersized, and it needs to be able to consolidate the variety of DoD space agencies that still exist independently, that ostensibly it was stood up to consolidate all into one. Today, the Space Force only gets 3% of the entire Department of Defense budget. It simply can't do its missions to deter or defeat threats in space without more funding. In terms of personnel, the Space Force is the smallest of all of the services. There are Army bases and Air Force bases and Navy installations that one of their bases is bigger than the entire United States Space Force.
I was down at Fort Bragg a couple of summers ago, and I think the size of that dwarfs the size of the Space Force.
Right. And the other part of this, the third piece, is our national security space program is spread across more than 60 departments and agencies, which results in a glaring lack of accountability and leadership that undermines our combatant commanders, and it puts our warfighters at risk. That all needs to be integrated and fall under the direction of the Space Force. So there's a lot that needs to be done. And frankly, if we're going to get serious about defending our space systems, the Space Force needs more resources.
Right. General David Deptula, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Have a great air and space power kind of day.
And it's time now for Threats of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you all are listening to the show. And my threat of the week is American nuclear deterrence, or I guess the lack thereof, according to a new report that our colleague in front of the show, Bill Gertz, wrote about this week. That study from the National Institute Press found that America's current approach to strategic deterrence is not enough to protect the country from growing nuclear threats posed by China, North Korea, Russia, and that, among other steps, the U.S. ought to right away consider putting multiple warheads, adding them to the current missile stockpile. There are two main points quickly that converge to make this threat very serious right now. First, as Bill points out in detail in a story, the nuclear force, the U.S. nuclear force is aging, and it doesn't have enough warheads on its missiles to, in a worst-case scenario, threaten effective strikes against adversaries like Russia or China, which leads to the second reason this is a real problem: increasing cooperation between nuclear-armed adversaries like Russia and China. The military partnership between Russia and North Korea, a would-be nuclear power like Iran and its ties to those countries, China's nuclear buildup, Russia pulling out of the New START treaty, the potential for anti-satellite nuclear weapons in space. We can go on and on. Some arms control groups, of course, will argue these numbers really don't matter because there are more than enough nuclear weapons out there today to destroy the planet multiple times over. So who cares if the U.S. only has 1,600 warheads deployed versus the 2,200 the National Institute Press report calls for? But to me, it's still a threat because, let's be honest, this is an area where you don't want to see a lot of room for error, and falling behind adversaries in nuclear strike capabilities isn't somewhere the United States wants to be right now.
Interesting, Ben. My threat of the week has to do with great power competition in Syria. There's been a slew of dangerous activity recently in Syria relating to sectarian violence, the post-Assad government's handling of it, Israeli military bombing of areas, a U.S. military raid that killed a top Islamic State operative there in recent days. We actually covered that in Threat Status, Ben, and so on. So it's barely in the news, though. And a lot of what's happening on the ground inside Syria right now could potentially re-destabilize the entire Middle East at a moment when things have a chance of calming down between Israel and Iran and Israel and Hamas and Gaza. My threat of the week, though, is that U.S. influence in Syria is under threat of being eclipsed by Russia, where Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov quietly hosted the new Syrian government's top diplomat for a summit in recent days. Ben, the Trump administration's foreign and national security policy bandwidth is saturated with other things right now. Ukraine, China, a war that briefly broke out between Thailand and Cambodia, not to mention the Gaza humanitarian crisis. Washington needs to pay attention to what Russia is doing with its diplomatic instrument of power in the Middle East, because there is consensus in the U.S. intelligence community, Ben, that Moscow will, whenever possible, try to undermine what it sees as America's or Trump's interests in the region.
Yeah, so many moving parts, to say the least. So thank you for that. And a huge thank you to retired General Deptula for that great conversation this week on the show. And a huge thanks to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Share the podcast with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.